Hi, Mob. Welcome to the next episode of Journey to Black Belt with Shantelle Thompson, a space where we yarn about what does it take and what does it mean to be a black belt, whether it's in martial arts, in life, in sport, in business, in your culture, in your leadership, in your journey, and in the roles that you play. And it's not about actually having a black belt. If you have a black belt, that's a bonus. But for those of you that are leading in your spaces or are feeling called to lead or are rising into leadership positions or spaces or projects or movements, what does it mean and what does it take to be a black belt at that level? What responsibility, what preparation, what journey have you been on to be a black belt, or to become a black belt? But what does it mean to be a black belt in your space, in your in your things, in yourself? What is a black belt mindset? So for those of you that don't know me, my name is Shantelle Thompson. I'm a proud Barkindji Yimpa woman, and I have had a journey. The world tried to write my story for me before I was even born. And that's what I want to talk to you about today. There is so many different things being discussed at the moment, but the Super Bowl just happened in America, and we know that the game is important, and yet the narrative and the opportunities for different narratives and stories and movements to be supported or created through these platforms. And sport is a vehicle to create social change or to challenge current social norms and narratives is powerful beyond measure, because sport brings us together unlike almost anything else in the world. And yet power has a sport to be a vehicle that can create change beyond the sport itself. And that's what I want to yarn with you about today is something that happened, and it centers Serena Williams and her journey from Wimbledon to the Super Bowl, and a post that I've seen on LinkedIn. So my journey has been one from suicide to world champion. Jiu-jitsu was a vehicle for me to reconnect to myself, to my culture, and it took me on a journey from a mental health crisis of postpartum psychosis in which I hurt my daughter and I tried to suicide, to then going on a journey to healing, to reconnecting to my culture, to finding a purpose that was bigger than me, something that was worth fighting. And jiu-jitsu was an arena and a space where I could find myself and be myself in order to be able to face and become the person I needed to become, to not only face the challenges in me, but to do so grounded in my culture, in my dreaming, and my power as a woman, as a mother, and as a First Nations person. And that journey took me on to win 3 world titles. I was honored with my black belt in July of 2023. And I am now on my journey to what does it take to become a black belt, let alone to be a black belt world champion. And I want to share this post with you because it's really important that I start from this context and I honor the person who kind of sparked this for me. And it was a post on LinkedIn from Casey Brown, who is a personal brand expert. She's also a mum. So if you're on LinkedIn, check her out. And the post really resonated with me and got me thinking, what does it mean to be unapologetic in 2025, particularly if the world has tried to condition it out of you, your heritage, or you've faced genocide, or who you are has been weaponized against you, or the colonial, patriarchal, and Western world has tried to assimilate you into their narrative and experience and wipe you out. So the post goes, 12 years ago, this dance almost cost her reputation. Last night at the Super Bowl, it made her a legend. I know everyone is talking about Kendrick today, but last night Serena Williams did the damn thing. It's funny to think that just a few years ago, this dance caused mayhem. The difference, the space she was in. At Wimbledon, what she did was immature and classless. Fox Sports. Separated from the violence associated with that dance. LA Times. Faced pressure to apologize for celebrating her gold medal. For being a woman who celebrated her culture and her heritage through dance to celebrate her win as an athlete. Yet at the Super Bowl, surrounded by Kendrick Lamar's unapologetic blackness, standing alongside other black artists owning their narratives, free to be joyful, petty, and gloriously herself. Even joked backstage, man, I did not crip walk like that at Wimbledon. I would have been fined. Now let that sink in. Some context. 79% of black women report having to change their behavior at work to make others comfortable. Catalyst. 54% of black women leaders report feeling pressure to modify their communication style or appearance. McKinsey. Companies with inclusive cultures are 2 times more likely to meet or exceed financial targets. Deloitte. Here's the truth. When we create spaces where black women don't have to shrink, when we center black voices and experiences, when we celebrate instead of police black joy, magic happens. And sometimes that magic looks like a tennis goat doing the crip walk on the world's biggest stage right after her ex got dissed while millions cheer. That's not just pettiness. That's not just dancing. That's freedom. The real question, why does this freedom only exist in certain spaces? And what are we doing to change that? Because if Serena Williams, a 23 Grand Slams greatest of all time, couldn't be her full self at Wimbledon, but found the freedom to dance without apology at a black-centered Super Bowl halftime show, just think about how many black women are still holding back their magic, still dimming their light, still dancing smaller than they dream. The blueprint is clear. Create the space, center black joy, step aside, and watch magic happen. Now, what that did for me was it was powerful and it was challenging, and obviously it was centered on the black experience, and yet I wondered if that lens would be turned to a gendered experience or an Indigenous experience, and what that would look like through our lens and our world. And right now, what it feels like with the war on being Indigenous and the attack on any progress that's made, and particularly in Australia and New Zealand for one, and it was profound, and it really got me thinking in terms of where are we at now and what does this actually look like? So today I want to honor that post and what it sparked for me, and being brave enough to try something new and some new tech around wanting to have these uncensored, unscripted yarns with you, and yet also bringing some structure to my podcast and being able to share across multiple platforms in multiple mediums, whilst honoring the fact that I'm new to tech, I speak from the heart, and I'm also a woman with a very full life of being a mum to 5 children, 3 at home, a founder, an athlete on my own journey, and a woman with a lot of things, a lot of roles going on. So working to simplify so that I can amplify out into the world my message and the things I feel called to share with you more, because I love podcasting, I love yarning with you. So I'm looking at how can I do that across multiple mediums, across multiple platforms with the one thing. So in today's title, Unapologetic Serena Williams, Indigenous Sovereignty, Women's Power, and the Warrior's Path. So the theme for this post and this podcast today centered from my notes, Karen's post, and my own, I guess, journey, and where the ancestors guide this yarn is what does it mean to be reclaiming space, power, and the cost of taking a stand? But also, what does it take? What does it mean to take a stand? Where are you feeling called to take a stand? Where are you avoiding taking a stand because it doesn't feel safe? And yet imagine what would happen if you did take a stand, and not from becoming someone else, but by being yourself. And what level are you at in terms of your own internal voice, power? What level are you at, and how equipped are you to take a stand? It's about sovereignty and power and the courage to walk your own path, no matter the cost. Because there's always a cost to pay when we choose to step up and take a stand. And I know I've paid that price. I've made that sacrifice when I've stepped up and I've spoken my truth in my culture, in my home, in my own head and my own heart, in my own relationships, intimate family relationships, in my jiu-jitsu spaces, my community, the lot. And the cost of speaking my truth has meant that I've had to walk away from some spaces, some people, some relationships, because I am no longer willing to pay the price of not being myself or sacrificing or abandoning myself in order to be allowed to belong in other people's spaces or other people's truths. And using Serena Williams' walk at Wimbledon and the Super Bowl as a lens, I want to explore how Indigenous, Black, marginalized women, cultures are policed when we step into the spaces that were not built for us and not built by us. And what it means to reclaim our space and use our platforms and carry the cost of taking a stand, but also carrying the power and the potential of taking a stand. Because yes, there's a cost, but often for those of us that take a stand, we do so from a considered perspective of the power and the potential of taking a stand is far more compelling than the sacrifice or the cost that we will have to pay and the potential risk for taking that stand. Because I know that when I had to take a stand to save my own life so that my children would no longer be a risk because of the choices and who I was being through my trauma and my illness, was that I wasn't willing to allow them to pay the price or to be collateral damage to my trauma and my mental illness. When I ended my 20-year relationship due to family violence and not feeling like I was allowed to be myself or to have a voice or to be my own voice in my own home. And when I did use my voice, it was weaponized against me. My culture, my trauma, my dreams, my work was all weaponized against me to silence me, to keep me small, particularly when I stood up. And I think the biggest thread through my journey is when I have stood up to speak my truth or stood up to challenge other people to step up, how they have weaponized myself and who I am against me to try to silence me or to keep me playing small or to keep me from expecting them to step up, expecting them to step into their power and their journey and their potential. And that's what I've had to accept, is that you cannot carry other people to their own power and to their own potential. You cannot force people to take responsibility, and you can't take responsibility for them, because you disempower and you dishonor people when you try to take responsibility for their stories and their journey. And for me, for Indigenous people globally, sovereignty is deeply personal. It is who we are and who we are as individuals in our power, in our truth, in our gifts and our strength, in our dreaming, is the very thing that honors and unleashes the power and the potential of the collective. So, for example, when our culture has been weaponized against us, but then has been appropriated for the benefit of colonial Western patriarchal systems. So Indigenous cultures are inherently collective. When our role as individuals is to contribute to the collective good, but not to the detriment of the self. And when I as an individual have a responsibility to ensure that who I'm being and what I have and my strengths are to contribute to the collective purpose, is that in my self-actualization is the actualization of our culture and of our collective. So let's take, for example, that was weaponized against us when colonial systems and Western systems came to try and wipe us out. My culture is inherently matriarchal in the way that we raise our children. We inherit the mother's bloodline, the mother's name. We don't follow the father's line. And yet when colonization came to Australia, they took away our children because they knew to take away country and hunting from our leaders and our providers would break our spirit. To take away our children would be to take away our hearts, and to take us from country would be to take us from our mothers. They were strategically and systematically focused on breaking us down as human beings and taking away the essence of who we were, in the hope that we would die off or be assimilated into colonial and Western systems, and the Indigenous would no longer be a factor in Australia in the colonial Australian narrative or landscape. And yet, how is me and my Indigenous power a threat to the Western colonial narrative? Why is me being a sovereign, Indigenous, powerful woman who can speak my language, who can bring my heritage and my truth to the table, a threat to the point to Western governments and colonial and patriarchal narratives and systems that we are still being hunted? Our very culture and history and trauma is being gaslighted, is being weaponized against us. I will leave you to form your own opinions on that. And yet, when I take a stand, how does me being in my power threaten other people to the point where I've had to decide to leave relationships, to leave, I've left coaches because they didn't respect or value what I brought to the table as an athlete, as a woman, as a mother, as a First Nations woman. I've left coaches, I've left gyms because of this, because I wasn't respected or valued, or it was actually weaponized against me. I've ended, like I said, I ended my 20-year relationship because I couldn't be myself in that relationship. So I know the sacrifice and the cost, and yet the cost of losing myself versus the cost of losing my relationship, and the cost of losing myself was a price I wasn't willing to pay. So I took a stand, and yet I know what it feels like to be policed, to be told you're not allowed, you're not enough, you're not good enough, you're too much. And yet the power of being myself and being sovereign and unapologetic in my sovereignty as a woman, as a First Nations woman, as a mother, as an athlete, and the power of just being myself and what that means. And that to me is what sovereignty is about, is that in my sovereignty, in my self-actualization, is that unlocks other people when I unlock myself. So as another example, so our culture was weaponized against us and used against us, but then the cultural appropriation of our culture to the benefit of Western systems is Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Now, this is just what I've read. I haven't substantiated this in my research. And so if I've gotten this wrong, please let me know. I read somewhere that Maslow's hierarchy of needs was a flipped and appropriated version of a Native American cultural practice. So the article that I read was that Maslow was stuck in his work, and one of his colleagues invited him to go to a First Nations reservation. And his work is that the hierarchy of needs is that at our base, we need food, water, and belonging, and self-actualization is at the top. But in this Native American culture that he went to visit, it was actually the opposite. The individual self-actualization is at the bottom, is the necessity, is the most baseline of human needs, is the self-actualization of the self. And then through ourselves, as the individual actualizes, so does the culture. And then everything else just becomes a ripple effect or a beneficiary of the individual actualizing into themselves and their gifts and their path. And this resonated so deeply with me at a soul level that I knew elements of it to be true. Because as I have reclaimed and remembered who I am beyond a colonial patriarchal narrative, and not through the prostitution of my trauma, rather through the remembering and reclamation of my inherent power and worth just by being born a First Nations woman. As I have strengthened and actualized into my gifts and my power and reclaimed those gifts and that strength and that responsibility of what it means to be a First Nations woman in a colonial patriarchal Western system and conditioning, and the work to re-indigenize myself, and what does a black belt level of that look like? I know I've strengthened other people. When I'm in that space, I am unstoppable. I am unapologetic. I am powerful. And yet when I resist that, or I try to seek validation and belonging from other people and spaces and systems that don't respect or honor that or don't allow for that, I become less than myself. The cost is one I'm not willing to pay any longer. And like I said, sovereignty for First Nations mob it's deeply personal. It's a responsibility. It's our culture, and it's about our journey of reclamation, re-indigenizing ourselves, particularly if we have grown up disconnected or unable to connect or have the resources to learn our language, our culture, or we don't have cultural knowledge holders in our lives or in our families who can sit with us and raise us through Indigenous principles and practices. So I grew up being a First Nations woman, and I grew up with some elements of First Nations culture, but I didn't grow up with fluent access to language, to ceremony, to women's business, to healing and all these. I grew up with tastes of it or certain parts of it. To be a sovereign First Nations woman for me is the ability to, the right and the responsibility to exist fully as myself, nothing less but nothing more. To express my identity, to take up space, and to lead and serve without apology as a Barkindji Yimpa woman. To take on the responsibility to not just be Barkindji Yimpa, but to do it, to go out and learn from the elders, the cultural resources and the cultural knowledge holders that exist, and investing the time and the resources, the money and the effort to resource that knowledge, to go and learn it, so I can become and be a Barkindji Yimpa woman beyond just the song, just the title and the connection to my bloodlines, but I have that cultural knowledge, that cultural practice. And standing firm in my truth and understanding that the power and the potential far outweighs the cost, but I also need to be mindful of the cost, and that it's not always safe to take a stand. So understanding the moments where it's not safe and what do I need to build the capacity, the resources, and the foundations for me to be able to take a stand in my truth, and having the wisdom to know when I can take a stand, when I need to take a stand, and when it's safer not to take a stand and to step back until I'm resourced, or to use my voice to support other people's voices, to elevate other people. I don't always need to be the one leading. So I think that's the wisdom and the discernment. And that's what it means to be a black belt, is to know when to move forward, when to make a move, and your own inner expertise and skills and strengths versus your weaknesses, and when to honor your opponent or the moment and the opportunity versus the wisdom to tap out versus to keep fighting. Like, these are all different elements of what it means to be a black belt in your own practice, in your own life, is to take the responsibility to become the most powerful version of yourself, the journey of self-mastery. And I mean, we just need to step away at the moment and to take a look at the world and what it's going to cost to take a stand right now. The world is a scary place if you are a woman, if you are a person of diverse, from a diverse experience of diverse gender or cultures, experiences. We only need to look at the world right now and where it's not safe to take a stand, or where things are being attacked and almost trying to take things backward. We are witnessing attacks on Indigenous sovereignty, gender rights, and D&I initiatives worldwide, just to name a few. In Australia, we only have to look at the consequences of the failed Indigenous Voice to Parliament referendum on October 14th, 2023, and its impact on how our identity is being weaponized and politicized. Our very humanity is up for debate in Peter Dutton's journey and story. The fact that he didn't take a stand for the apology, he says he will not fly the Indigenous flags, that he was a driver behind the no vote. Like, if he gets voted in, what does that mean for the Indigenous experience and identity and story in Australia? The fight against and the reality of the levels of violence against women in Australia, I mean globally, but speaking from my own context, my own backyard, a woman a week is being killed to gender-based violence in Australia, and that's just the ones that are being That's just the ones that are dying from this. We're not also talking about the numbers of women who are being harmed, who are being made to flee their homes and hide themselves and their children from perpetrators. And so Matt and Sarah are the leaders and founders behind the movement She Is Not My Rehab. So if you don't know the movement yet from Matt and Sarah of She Is Not My Rehab, please go and check it out. It is a powerful movement. And I recently heard Matt and Sarah speak in Mildura, and they were so powerful and generous in their acknowledgement and respect to First Nations people and being on First Nations country. And they said, how can a country address the reality of gender-based violence and women losing their lives weekly, and yet also addressing the cause and the drivers of violence against women, when we are in a country that refuses to acknowledge and take responsibility for the fact that our very history and story was generated and perpetuated on violence. Until the country can acknowledge its violence and its war on First Nations people and history, how can we begin to address the violence and war on gender and women? In New Zealand, like the attack on the Te Aroha Māori, sorry, my First Nations my Māori brothers and sisters, I am butchering that. I will do better. And the erasure of Māori language and culture, the treaty has been there. It was accepted by previous governments for more than 50 years. And yet the current government that is in is trying to remove the Māori language from being a national dual language. And I know it's more complicated than that, but what is the threat? Why is the Māori, which is the first language of Aotearoa, which is now known as New Zealand, such a threat to the modern day government that they need to focus their attention and resources on trying to tear down what has already been working for 50 years? And that was the first language. English was not the first language of these countries that are now colonial Western systems. Imagine how much more powerful our healing and our cultures and our economies and our country and our communities would be if First Nations heritage and sovereignty was embraced, was celebrated, was learnt from. Yet it's not. In America, the rollback on gender rights, D&I programs, and the silencing of marginalized voices with Trump being voted in and what his focus is. The very fact that he chose his day of inauguration to be on Martin Luther King's day of celebration and honouring. In Australia, the fact that the National Day of Australia Day, what is supposed to be our National Day of Pride, where we all get to celebrate being proud Australian people, was decided by a white Prime Minister and government to be celebrated on the day in 1938 where First Nations people decided that was our National Day of mourning. Yet 30 or 40 years later, a white Prime Minister decided, no, our National Day of Pride should be on the 26th of January, a day that First Nations people have decided is a National Day of mourning. I'll leave that with you to ponder a little bit more. And yet, I want you to reflect on a few things. What does it take to stand firm in your power when the world pushes back? Who gets to take up space without consequences, and who pays the price for standing out? And what happens when we shrink, and what happens when we refuse? I mean, we only have to look at Adam Goodes in Australia as a prime example. When he stood up and celebrated his cultural pride and danced and did the war dance, he was told it made other people fearful, it was aggressive, it was violent. And when he took his stand against a teenage girl who booted him and called him a monkey, and he stood staunch in his culture and took a stand for himself, that was weaponized and he was left alone. The people who should have rallied around him and stood up and supported that was not okay. That yes, it was a teenage girl, but she learnt that from somewhere, that it was an act of racism. And Adam should be applauded for taking a stand and standing firm. And yet he was attacked. He was ridiculed. It was weaponized against him for far too long, until finally he'd had enough and he stepped down And then everyone stepped up and said, oops, sorry, we should have stepped in earlier. Like when Kathy Freeman decided to run and celebrate both her cultures, she celebrated being Australian and being Aboriginal, and yet that was attacked as well. So imagine winning on the world's biggest stage. Imagine giving your all, your sweat, your blood, your sacrifices, only to be told that the way you celebrate, the way you exist in your body and culture is unacceptable. It's not allowed, and you can literally be fined. I mean, the player, I forget, is it Colin Krippenyak? Again, I should know more, but again, this is from the heart, so forgive me if I've made errors in my statements. But when he took to the knee and refused to sing the national anthem, his whole career was taken from him because he refused to stand for a national anthem that did not speak truth, that did not represent all of the people and the histories and cultures in America. I mean, even looking at the American context, so much focus is on the Black experience. So many Black people and Black movements have elevation, have a global focus, have a global reach, have a global voice and platform. Yet where do Native Americans stand in their platform? The Indigenous experience in America, in their own country, is marginalized first and foremost to the slavery history. I mean, that's a 500-year-old history, but there was a history before that of Indigenous people, the genocide, the reservations, the murdering. I mean, there was murdered missing Indigenous women across America and Canada and Australia is still a silenced epidemic that is happening. Mass graves of Indigenous children have been found at residential schools, and yet there is not a national outrage. In Australia, a ceremony called Welcome to Country is being targeted as going as an unprecedented waste of resources and a cost, because people are complaining that people should be paid to do these Welcome to Country ceremonies, which are a 60,000-year-old practice, and people are going, oh, it shouldn't be done. It makes white people feel bad. I don't understand why I have to do it. And yet, why do we have to sing the national anthem? Why should we celebrate Australia Day on the 26th of January? How much is spent on Anzac Day and Anzac ceremonies? Why are these costs different? Why is there an allowance for one and not for the other? And this is what happened to Serena Williams. Like at Wimbledon, she had earned that moment, but the world decided the Western colonial patriarchal world had decided that her expression of joy, her movement, her culture, her very body was too much. The same crip walk years later at the Super Bowl was met with cheers. The difference? The space she was in. So why do some spaces force us to shrink while others allow us to rise? And who gets to decide where we belong? And why do some people pay a higher price for simply taking up space? So when you do take up space, there is always going to be a price to pay. And I guess only you can determine whether the price and the sacrifice that is going to come and the risk is worth it. And do you have what it takes to carry the ripple effect, like the immediate cost, but also the ripple effect of the momentum of taking a stand in that moment? Do you have the resources, the capacity, the support, either internally or externally, to be the person who takes up a stand? And what is the consequence and the cost of not taking a stand? And sometimes we don't know that in the moment. Sometimes we feel so compelled to take a stand that we can't fully understand or comprehend the potential cost or ripple effect of taking that stand until after the fact. And then sometimes we can. And where can we go? But also, what is the power and the potential that comes from the planting of the seed of that one event? Martin Luther King's speech, I Have a Dream. I mean, he lost his life. He was assassinated for standing up and taking a stand. And yet the ripple effect of him, that speech, that moment, that historical moment, Nelson Mandela lost 27 years of his life to taking a stand. And yet, by him taking a stand and choosing peace and choosing his truth and his way changed the world as we know it today. So many people, so many moments to think of. So when we take up space, we become a threat. Indigenous, Black and marginalized bodies are policed differently in spaces of power. We have different metrics. We have different justifications. We're expected to be better. Women are expected to play by different rules and we're held to a different standard to men. Indigenous people are held to a different standard to white people. And I was only in a situation recently when I was trying to get some support for a family of who had children in the foster care system and who had been placed in permanent care. And I was working in Western and colonial systems, and we were working with the Department of Families and Fairness, and this is the Department of Child Protection that removes children. Now, I myself did not seek help. I did not seek medical help because I was frightened if I stood up and said, hey, I need help as a Black mother, as an Indigenous mother in this country, that would be code for I can't cope, my children aren't safe. And if I put my hand up and said, I'm not coping and I need help, that they would give them permission to take my children from me. This is lived reality. I have this experience. When I stood up and I spoke my truth and I took a stand and said, I'm not well, I need help, the doctor that I sought help from said, I've noticed on your file you're of Indigenous heritage and I want to call Child Protection and the police to do a welfare check on you and your family, but also I want you to spend time in a mental health facility. I'd noticed on your file you're of Indigenous heritage and I want to do a welfare check. This was after I had reached out to her for help and said, I am not well. Rather than supporting me and saying, hey, these are the services that you can go to. Thank you for coming. Here's how I can help you. She weaponized my current experience and my culture against me to try and take my children. Because me putting my hand up saying I'm unwell translated to her children are unsafe and she's not capable. This is my lived experience as a woman. That was in 2009. That was in 2010. I had another experience of a child protection worker coming to my front door in 2023 to try and remove a young person from my door. And it was only because I knew the language. It was only because I was educated. And it was only because I knew the words to say that stopped the removal of a young person from my home by a child protection worker who was acting more like a 1950s mission manager than she was as someone who was there to try to empower and ensure the safety and the voice of this young person was heard. Because taking a stand comes with sacrifices, and many of us can pay with your careers, your reputations, our families, our livelihoods, and sometimes even our safety and our very lives. I mean, people who have spoken up have lost their lives. People who are speaking up and speaking their truth, the Gaza Strip. I mean, women who speak their truth in Australia and their relationships or who choose to stand in their power and leave relationships are being killed by their ex-partners who believe in their head that they have the right and the power and the ownership of this woman and sometimes her children and the right to take her life because she didn't no longer wanted to be in that relationship. And this yarn is important. It needs to be had because our very humanity, who we are as people, is weaponized against us. And when we choose to take a stand, it can cost us our lives, let alone the life we choose to live. And that all needs to weigh in. And yet there are people still fighting to take a stand. There are people who choose to sit back. There are people who benefit from our silence, from our disempowerment. There are people who are billionaires because women who buy into the narrative that we need to be younger and sexier and less fat, less wrinkles. Imagine the cost on the economy if women said fuck it and stopped worrying about what they look like. Now, I'm not saying it's a bad thing if you invest in what you look like. There's a difference between investing what you look like for your own personal empowerment and your own personal vibe of being staunch and being sexy for yourself before anyone else. That's different to feeling like in order to be enough for someone else or in order to be attractive or powerful for someone else or a space or a role, And then you're investing in these enhancement of lashes and nails and makeups and clothes and wardrobes to be good enough for someone else. That's a very different vibe and focus to being investing in your looks for yourself. Now, as a 41-year-old Aboriginal woman, a mother who has had 4 children, a woman who has had 4 children, and I had my first daughter at 22, my twins at 25, and my bounce back in my body was very different to having a child at 38. At 38, I was 144 kilos when I had my son. I had an emergency C-section and I fractured my tailbone. So my recovery and my journey, my weight loss, my finding my satisfaction in myself as a woman took 2 years. And yet I still felt this need to lose the weight, to look a certain way. I didn't know how to dress to feel good in my body. So that was my experience. Now imagine if I was like, I'm beautiful and sexy as I am, regardless of those outer trappings. And I was also okay with the fact that I was working to become the strongest, fittest, healthiest version of myself for myself, but also for the life that I want to live, that I want to be able to do jiu-jitsu until I'm in my 80s, that I want to be able to be active with my youngest son right up until his teen years, because I was an older mum with him. Like, that's the difference of what it means to take a stand and from what perspective and lens I'm viewing taking a stand from. But privilege also matters. Why and where does privilege matter? And who gets to determine the use of our privilege? And those of us with a voice and a platform, we have a responsibility to use it. Or if we feel called and compelled to develop and build a platform and a voice, who do we bring with us? Who do we seek to share that journey with? Who do we seek to collaborate with? These are all important things. Where do we choose to spend our money? Where do we choose to speak up? Where can we speak up? And whose other voices can we elevate in our journeys and in our platforms? These are all important questions because there's a difference between being a woman and doing a woman on the front line. There's a difference between being a Barkindji Yimpa woman or being a First Nations woman and doing it on the front line. And there's a difference between being a mother and doing a mother. Like the difference of going, I just want a healthy relationship with my kids. I wish I didn't have to fight with them. I wish I didn't have to pull them or push them when I felt the need to. I wish I understood how to be the mother that I wanted to be without second guessing myself that me being this version of my mother is going to cost me my children. That who I'm being as a mother now, is it going to help them later on or is it going to add more trauma to them? All valid experiences, because my journey of being a mother ranges from my 18-year-old right down to my 3-year-old, but also being a matriarch and an auntie and a guide and an elder and a mentor to all those that call me Auntie Shan or see me as a contributing factor to their journey. Like, who am I responsible for? Who am I impacting by how I'm showing up and who I'm being in the world? And how do I find peace within myself to trust that if I am being myself, if I'm being me in the most aligned, true version of myself, and I'm doing the best I can with what I have and I'm moving from a place of love in my heart and I'm doing the best I can, then finding peace in letting go of how that's received by others and the fact that in this season, in this journey, in this chapter, it might mean that I'm someone else's enemy or that my kids hate this version of me or they don't see themselves as being beneficiaries of who I am. Because the reality is that I need to be their mum first, not their friend, not this ideal version of it. All I can do is do the best I can. And I didn't have my mum in my life. I didn't have a steady, stable mother figure, and my dad was doing the best he could. So I've never had that version of a motherhood. I don't know that version. So I'm learning that all for myself. I'm moving through my own trauma. And when I'm parenting my 17-year-old daughter, sometimes that means going back and reparenting my inner 17-year-old that didn't get that version. I don't know how to meet myself in that moment, let alone my daughter, and finding a way to be okay with that and doing the best I can with what I've got. And the cost of taking a stand when my teenager says that they hate me and they don't like this version of me, and going, well, if I'm doing the best I can and I feel like this is the next best step, finding a way to be okay with that, to move forward. And So some reflection questions for you. When have you seen someone being punished for standing in their truth? And what is the consequences and what is the cost of staying silent? And how can we leverage our privilege and platform for those who do not have the same safety or the same privilege or the same resources? Who else can we contribute to? Who else can we collaborate with? Like, where can we amplify our impact and where can we throw our support and resources? And what is our work, but what is not our work? Because sometimes we feel called to contribute or do things that are not ours to do. You will know what is your work and what is not. When you do the inner work, you will be guided. What is the global pushback against sovereignty and inclusion at the moment? I mean, in New Zealand, the attack on the Te Reo Māori and the erasure of Māori identity and political representation. And yet, the staunchness of so many Māori people, Māori brothers and sisters who are taking a stand, who are refusing to be silent, and yet knowing what is the cost that they have to pay to speak up and take that stand. But they choose that the cost of silence is a price they're not willing to pay. They are fighting not just for themselves and their own sovereignty now and their voices now and their language and their culture and their place in Aotearoa, but for 7 generations to come. They are taking their responsibility to take a stand now, but also for the generations to come. The war on gender rights and D&I and the silencing of marginalised communities, the silencing of the Indigenous voice in America. In Australia, the failure of the Indigenous voice to Parliament referendum and the impact on the ripple effect on the impact of so many other things from that one decision, and the fact that our right to self-determine and be sovereign, whether we should have a place in Australia in the Constitution as the first people, but also have a say in the policies that only affect us, was given to the rest of Australia. We're only 3% of the population, and yet our right to be self-determined and sovereign was given to the rest of Australia to decide, where many don't understand the history. The truth is weaponized. The truth is denied. And how are these issues connected? Progress is always met with resistance because power does not always let go easily. Those that are resisting our progress benefit and are privileged from our entrapment, from us not having that power and that sovereignty and that self-determination. So, an opportunity to ask more questions. What does sovereignty mean in your country, in your community, in your own life, in your own journey? How do we hold on to progress when there is pushback? And how do we accept our part to play and trust that if we are doing our bit, if we are using our strengths and our voices and our resources to contribute in our own backyards and in our own way, and we are contributing from who we are and what we have, that is enough, that is enough to create progress, to create momentum, or to create resources for someone to take our contribution to take it a little bit further. And that contribution does not have to cost us our lives, or it does not require us to sacrifice or abandon ourselves in order to contribute. And who is fighting for changing your community? And how can you support them? Where can you contribute your resources to someone else's movement? Where can you elevate someone else's voice? The warrior path, walking your own path, walking your own journey, being the warrior heart, standing in your power, being your truth, and following your heart to where you are called to contribute, where you can contribute, and what you can do now versus what you can do to grow. Sometimes we need to step back and prepare ourselves before we can step forward. And sometimes it isn't about, sometimes we don't choose the leadership moment. Sometimes we don't choose the fight. Sometimes we are called to these moments. Sometimes the path chooses us. And I would prefer to be a warrior in a garden than a gardener in a war. I would prefer to be prepared for when I am called to step up. I would prefer to be grounded in my culture, to be ancestrally guided and dreaming led, than to be led by my trauma and my pain. I mean, Serena Williams is a warrior. She took the criticism, she kept winning, and she never stopped being herself. And now she can elevate that. She can bring other people, but she had to first become Serena Williams before she could become Serena Williams. This is the thing. Most of us look at people like Serena Williams and we shut down and go, I could never be that person. You don't need to be her. You can be inspired and empowered by her. And then internalize that lens. What would that look like in your own life? Where can you take a stand? Where do you feel compelled to do something different? What are the consequences of you avoiding that work? Where are you avoiding taking a stand? And what can you do? What do you want to do? And what could you do? The black belt journey is a lesson in resilience and what it teaches us about standing firm in our power. Where is your arena? Where can you prepare yourself? Where can you become a master of yourself? Where can you become sovereign and self-determined in your voice, in your journey, in your power and your gifts, so that when you are needed in your life or in the world, you are ready to step up. You are doing the work, but you are also trusting that with the work that you have done, that when the moment calls you, that you are good enough, that you are as ready as you can be, and you step up and take the step. You do the work, and then when you're not needed anymore, you step back. This is an Indigenous practice. We are called to lead. We are called by the moments in our lives, whether by our community, someone else identifying you as having the skills or the resources to step up and solve a problem, or to be a leader in that moment, or you'll get pulled. I was called to be a world champion. It chose me. I was called to do Kililana. So when I was on my journey of, when I hurt my daughter, the day in the moment that I was so sick with postnatal depression, and by avoiding it, by avoiding the boulder, the inner knowing that I was unwell and I needed help, I could no longer do it alone, but not feeling safe, not feeling supported, and not feeling resourced to do something, led to the moment where I hurt my daughter and I tried to take my own life. And my children almost got taken from me by a system that was not set up to see me succeed or be nurtured as an Indigenous mother in this country or in this world. And yet in that moment, I knew I had a choice. When I still found myself alive after trying to take my life, that whisper came to me, that knowledge was that no one was coming for me. No one could do this but me. I could be supported, but the choice was on me. And the cost and the consequence of hurting my children was not a price I was willing to pay. So I stepped up. And jiu-jitsu and culture became the arenas where I became myself, where I mastered myself enough to become the mother that my children needed, that I mastered myself enough to heal myself so that I could be a mother and I could be well again, that I could go on and finish my university degree. That would be the seed that would, and the foundations that would lead me on to becoming a 3-time world champion. Kililana Foundation was founded when I refused to buy into the deficit narrative and prostitute my trauma any longer to justify my power and rise as a First Nations woman. I was always led by the power of the possibility, not by the driver of my pain. I was always like, what is on the other side of this? Yes, pain became a great motivator and instigator and a catalyst at certain points in the journey. But the foundations of my rise came from me believing in the bigger potential and possibility. And Kililana started because I looked around my community and did not see a space for our women and our girls to just be proud First Nations women, to learn and practice culture, to heal themselves and to be well, and to figure out who they wanted to be before the demands of the world drew them into being versions of themselves that benefited everyone else but themselves and their own truth. And we are this year, we are celebrating 5 years, and we've had over 200 girls come through our program. We've delivered over 600 cultural connection programs. We've created a dance program. Like, there's so many things that came from that moment where I decided that the power and potential was greater than the cost or sacrifice that I was going to have to pay. And trust me, I have paid to be myself in the world. It has cost me to be the Barkindji warrior in the world, to be Anishan, to be the founder of Kililana. And yet I would pay those prices and that cost over and over again, because I know what has come from me taking that stand and speaking that truth and being that person. And the warrior heart, knowing the fight will be hard, but choosing to stand anyway, and choosing to see those battles as preparing you, as resourcing you, as equipping you for who you need to be, to step into your power, to step into the leadership, to become the person you need to be to have the life that you dream of, or to be able to take up the fight that you feel called and compelled to. Like, and the courage of those who came before me that refused to conform. The shoulders, the example, the shoulders that I stand on of the elders and the leaders who came before me, who showed the way. And now knowing it's my turn to step up, knowing who's watching me, the power and the possibilities that happen that unlock for other people through my example, through the spaces that I create, the stories that I share, what could happen from me sharing this. And I know that, I want to ask you this. Where are you called to take a stand right now? Where could you take a stand? What would you need to do to prepare yourself that when you are called to take a stand, you can do so from a place of self-mastery, of developed skill, of resources, of community? What does it mean to walk your own path even when the world resists, even when you resist? Because sometimes the world that resists is our inner world, is our inner narrative. And sometimes it's not about becoming, it's about being. It's not about undoing. It's about becoming. And how do we honor the warriors before us while forging new ground for those who are to come after? By being ourselves. How do you honor those who came before? By being you, but also how do you resource the generations to come? Just by being yourself. When we reclaim space and power and we use our platforms, we use our privilege and our power to unlock ourselves. We give permission to those who stand and we resource generations to come. Because we have a responsibility to use our platform, our privilege and resources that we can do to create change. And it's not about looking at who's next to you. It's about what do I have and who am I now? What can I do to contribute as an individual to the collective purpose? And what seeds can you plant today for future generations to sit under that you will never see, that you will never be a beneficiary of, that you will never be acknowledged or validated for? Imagine how much more powerful our progress would be if more people stopped to seek validation or to have their names on doors and rooms and trophies to be validated for the work that they do, and just got on with the work that they were called to do. How much more progress we would make. How much further we would be in our humanity and our change and our healing. And if you have a voice, you must use it, because not everyone has that privilege. My strength is in my voice and in my courage, in my storytelling, in the fact that I'm guided by my ancestors and I can show up and share that with you. Where and how can you share your voice? What skills and strengths do you have? Where can you be a world champion in your own life? What dreaming is calling you? There is a power in sport, in business, in storytelling and leadership to challenge systems and shift narratives. For me, for Kilalana, it's about creating a space where we write the story grounded in ourselves and in our culture and our sovereignty. Stories about us and by us and for us. Rather than focusing on challenging the deficit narrative held by colonial systems and conditioning, grounding our stories and our narrative in our dreaming, in our culture and our ancestors' wisdom and guidance. How much further would our stories go? How much more powerful and wapanya, the power to keep giving back, would our stories be, and how much more self-sustaining would they be if they are grounded in our well-being, in our sovereignty, in our wealth, in our self-worth, in our self-belief? And how much more strengthened would that be if it wove into other people's journeys? If we started to weave our individual contribution into the person next to us, in our collaborations, in the sharing of our resources, and trusting that who we are is enough to show up as we are. Every time we rise, we create space and permission for others to rise too. And if Serena Williams, one of the greatest athletes of all time, was made to feel like she had to shrink herself, then imagine how many of us are still playing small. And the real fight is not just about winning in spaces that weren't built for us. It's about creating spaces where we can be our full selves unapologetically. It's not just about getting a seat at other people's tables and getting a space on other people's stages. It's about creating our own stages, taking back our own spaces, and honouring ourselves. So where are you being called to take up space? Speak up, call out the double standards when you see them, when it is safe to do so. build something, build a movement, put your resources behind someone else, contribute, follow that calling and trust that it is enough to create change now, not for tomorrow, but what you do today is enough to create change today and to plant seeds and to create momentum. Because the time of shrinking is over. We are called to step up. It is our generation's turn to take up that space, to take up that leadership, to honor those who came before us, to heal those that couldn't, to strengthen and resource and create the collective now so that generations ahead inherit and are collective beneficiaries of our work, not collateral damage to the silence or the lack of responsibility that we choose to take. Use your platform. If you have something, use it, share it, collaborate. Because when we step up and we take power, I mean, there's two quotes that I want to share with you, and it's the man in the arena, and it says, "It is not the critic who counts, not the man who points out how the strong man stumbles or where the doer of deeds could have done them better. The credit belongs to the man who is actually in the arena, whose face is marred by dust and sweat and blood, who strives valiantly, who errs, who comes up short again and again, who spends himself in a worthy cause, who at the best knows in the end the triumph of high achievement, and who at worst, if he fails, at least fails while daring greatly, so that his place shall never be with those cold and timid souls, who neither know victory nor defeat." And the Marianne Williamson quote. Because you know what? When we listen to those who are in the grandstands rather than in the arena with us, we give away our power. When we stand in our truth and we look to walk with those who are in the arena with us, or who have been in the arena and are further ahead and are reaching their hand behind them, those are the people that you want in your world, not the ones who sit back and judge, who only speak from the grandstand, who have no skin in the game. And yet this is the most powerful quote, the one that I implore you to look into yourself. Our deepest fear is not that we are inadequate. Our deepest fear is that we are powerful beyond measure. It is our light, not our darkness, that most frightens us. We ask ourselves, who am I to be brilliant, gorgeous, talented, fabulous? Actually, who are you not to be? You are a child of God. Your playing small does not serve the world. There is nothing enlightened about shrinking so that other people won't feel insecure around you. We are all meant to shine as children do. We were born to make manifest the glory of God that is within us. It is not just in some of us, it's in everyone. And as we let our own light shine, we unconsciously give other people permission to do the same. And as we are liberated from our own fear, our presence automatically liberates others. Marianne Williamson. I know from personal experience. I've had people message me that by me taking a stand, it empowers them to take a stand. By me starting my journey in jiu-jitsu has been the seed that has empowered other women to start their own martial arts journey. Me sharing my story has empowered other women to want to share their own story. Me starting my own business has empowered other women to say, if she can, I can. So what becomes possible? Who becomes possible if you become sovereign and unapologetic in your own journey? How can we take a leaf out of Serena's journey, that when she had the courage to take a stand at Wimbledon and she was punished for that, she was judged by that, and yet she did it. And yet how many years later she was invited to be a part of a history-making moment and was celebrated for her blackness, for her culture, for her story, her power, her journey as a black woman, for her history and her heritage. How and where can you take a stand? And what does that look like? Big love you, mob. I'd love to hear from you. If this has resonated with you, please let me know. Please share this with someone. Hit the like, subscribe button, and let me know if you want to hear more from this. And big love to Casey Brown for inspiring this powerful episode. And thank you to those who are supporting me in my new platform and my new method of sharing across different mediums to get this message out into the world. And the message itself is more important than the delivery. Big love you, mob.